Hello, class. So this today's lecture focuses on some reflections around immigration and human rights, specifically of how immigration policies or certain immigration policies can have serious consequences on the well-being of migrants and refugees, since their human rights become denied systematically. So in the following minutes, I want to, elaborate some reflections using the U.S. and Mexico border and recent immigration policies that both countries have implemented over the last few years. So before going into the subject, I just want to highlight, and this draws part in Sigmund Bauman's reading, or about the worldwide and systemic aspect of mass and forced displacement. This phenomenon is perhaps one of humanity's main pending human rights agendas. In this sense, perhaps the incapacity of modern states to treat with respect and dignity the millions of people that flee their homes due to violence, war, climate change, economic hardships, etc., reveals the inherent contradiction between the states founded on a human rights discourse and the idea of national identity on the one side, and the failure of those same states to provide the basic conditions for those people to enjoy a dignified life. Moreover, as Bauman would suggest, it is deeply problematic that it is when one belongs to a sovereign state and holds that state citizenship, that is the precondition for the practice of human rights, right? So in a world of mass migration across countries, this is a very problematic aspect. And in this regard, as in many others for sure, international law struggles very hard in having states committed to basic human rights principles. For instance, over 145 states have ratified the 1951 Refugee Convention and or its 1967 protocol, which both define the term of refugee and establish the principle of non-refoulement that asserts that refugees must not be returned to a country where they face serious threats to life or their freedom. However, and despite the worthy efforts of many Western and non-Western countries to become hosts for the newcomers, many countries still engage in practices that go against international principles, violating the basic rights of migrants. So we can say, and some of the images that you're seeing kind of displays this, that today's international migration routes are kind of a reversed mirror of what once was the European and Western colonization of the so-called Third World. However, mass displacements also, due to conflict and climate disasters and so on, also take place within national borders, as you can see in these images. In addition, migration detention centers, some meeting minimum criteria for the respect of human rights, and some others more punitive in nature, like they are like prisons in which migrants are being held. These centers just stretched across the world, as we can see in these graphs. Don't worry about the sources. I will send you the links with so you can navigate this information in length if you want. Another aspect that it's worth pointing out is how over the last decades the construction of physical borders has just gone up. First, and throughout and under the context of the Cold War, and then, more emphatically after 9/11. And one of those cases, of course, of barriers being built, not only physical, but also, if you will, discursive or social barriers, takes place between the U.S. and Mexico. In the next minutes, I will kind of touch very briefly on the historical context of U.S. immigration policies and how they connect with today's actions, such as the zero tolerance program or the migrant protection protocol. Well, let's take a look at that now. So, an historical perspective is really important to understand how today's immigration policies, such as the zero tolerance or the MPP, even as they are more extreme than the actions of past administrations, they still operate within a historical continuum, right, of state preference of certain populations over others. Since its independence, the U.S., one could argue, has privileged the immigration of, and quoting the Naturalization Act of 1790, free white persons of good moral character. While this meant encouraging the arrival of populations from Western and Northern Europe, and mainly of Protestant identity. In other words, since its conception, the U.S., as many other countries, shaped an idea of self, a national image that to a large extent excluded non-white populations such as slaves, Native Americans, Mexicans, Chinese, folks from Southern and Eastern Europe, etc. Now, one could also argue that throughout the 19th century, immigration was mainly addressed under the logic of the U.S. economy and military expansionism. Also, one can, remember that the revolutions in Europe and the gold rush, for instance, were also factors that pushed waves of immigrants towards the U.S. In this sense, labor, economy, and military logics shaped how mass movements of people within and beyond the country were framed. Despite the bans on Asian, and particularly Chinese immigration, the 19th century was still a period of time when large populations came into the US. And there were no main obstacles, at least not in the way that we understand them today. In the early 20th century, however, racism and support of, for instance, eugenics thinking influenced major regulations around immigration. For instance, in 1911, the Dillingham Commission of Congress published this report, which warned that, and I quote, the new immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe threatened to subvert American society. This was, in some sense, the foundation or the ideological basis for later quota acts of the 1920s that would favor, through a quota system, migration from northern and western Europe. Now, just like kind of a synthesis of these major historical moments, we have that in 1924 the Border Patrol is created. We have, this is important, that in 1929 there is the Undesirable Aliens Act, which, catchy name, pushed by eugenic supporters such as the Secretary of Labor James Davis, who saw people divided between, and I quote, good stock and bad stock. This act put limits on Mexican immigration into the U.S. by criminalizing unmonitored border crossing outside official ports of entry. In this sense, what we understand today as illegal immigration and illegal immigrants was born, right? This is the cornerstone of our thinking about this process and the agents involved in this process as illegal, right? It goes without saying that amid the Great Depression and throughout the 1930s, thousands of people were prosecuted, thousands of migrants were prosecuted and then deported. In this sense, I recommend you very strongly the book called The Latin Threat by USC Irving professor Leo Chavez. Makes a really nice analysis of the narrative of Mexican immigrants as a threat to the U.S. society. Anyway, we can talk about that another moment, but it kind of helps to understand this historical analysis that Trump, or the Trump phenomenon, is not necessarily an anomaly, but rather, or to some extent, a product of the very same historical conceptions of citizenship, race, and national identity of the last, at least of the last century. There are other stuff that are important in historical perspective, but I just want to highlight the turning moments: the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act under Reagan, which is important because it allows for the millions of undocumented immigrants to apply for legal status, but also made made a crime that employers would hire knowingly undocumented workers. So this is an important moment. And we also have in 1994, when NAFTA is signed and comes into force, the strategic plan, the INS strategic plan, which was based on prevention through deterrence, which already is explained in Gaston de Leon's reading. And that's a really important moment also. Then we have in 1996 Clinton's immigration bill, which kind of set the basis for today's mass deportation system by making it easier for migrants, both documented and undocumented, to become eligible for deportation. Last thing I want to say about the historical perspective is that after 9/11 and the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, migration became tied very closely, initial link very closely to security, right? And now in 2005, well, and then in 2005 with Operation Streamline, what we understand today as the mass deportation system was up and running well before Trump arrived into the scene. But again, goes without saying that Trump's policies just made this, turn this into a more radical situation. Now, finally, I just want to kind of a comment on how the zero tolerance policy that you kind of already saw in the WOLA reading. Of course, it's a program that, or a policy that uses the full force of the federal criminal justice system to persecute undocumented migration. That it's perhaps a way of prevention instead of through deterrence, prevention through punishment, due to the how it makes immigrants more likely to be punished with prison time than just to be deported. It is also a policy that uses family separation in a very systemic way, right? Which is a basic violation of people's human rights. It also kind of dismiss the approach to take care, to kind of respond properly to asylum seekers. And it's certainly more radical, but still remains within line of policies such as Operation Streamline. There is no evidence of actual migration deterrence, as we've read, that this program might have. And overall, this is, as far as you can get regarding a human rights approach towards immigration. And the same can be said of its extension protocol, the Migration Protection Protocol, in which practically it leads people, or sends migrants and asylum seekers back into border towns in Mexico or across the U.S.-Mexico border, on the Mexican side, which is practically with the levels of violence that Mexico is experiencing over the last decade at least. It's a clear violation of the non-refoulement principle in international law. And it also represents, or it also entails several obstacles for those seeking asylum. They're also separated from their families. They're also not allowed to be in touch with their relatives. There's a very few or very low access to legal representation. And while this is happening, right, of course, within political and electoral logics, but also, again, within this historical continuum of how the U.S. perceives itself, right, locally that is changing, I think. And if we understand, drawing on the last week's readings, human rights are an agenda, right, a project, and they're the product of social contestation, social mobilization, right, of struggles. And I think that in the next years it's going to be really interesting to see how the U.S., especially drawing on younger generations, kind of reshapes itself, and what type of national identity, whatever that is, project is going to emerge. Well, that is, I think, all for me. Thank you a lot for listening, and I hope that we can engage in some conversations around these issues on the discussion board. Thank you so much.